Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of 10 minutes of me ranting about some aspect of ancient warfare and me attempting to answer a question sent in by you, the viewer, listener, or reader. And thank you for all your questions. I've got many to get through, so that's always good. Of course, you can ask a question via various different ways. You can send us a postcard, PO Box 222 Belfield 2191 Australia. That will get to me. Always love a postcard. You can send me an email. You can comment on a previous video. In fact, any way you like, you can get us a video. I'm even got an interesting question asked for me in person, but that's a later issue, not today's question. Now, what we've got is a question today, I think from Today Tomic, 1943. I'm assuming that's how we say that. Hi, Murray. Do we know from historical historical sources, when the Greek hoplite ceased to exist? Thanks. Okay, the Greek hoplite. Now, it's controversy everywhere I turn when they're talking about the Greek hoplite. There was a traditional view of the emergence of the hoplite based on the Argive shield in the 7th century BC and the classic hoplite that we see on pottery in Greece. That's now become a controversy that, in fact, the classical hoplite is a much later evolution of Greek warfare, and that the main phalanx-style hoplites are really 5th century BC only, not earlier. I don't really agree with that, but that's okay. That's a controversy, and it's funny, whenever there's a new theory, a whole bunch of people latch onto the new theory as if it's the new orthodoxy, and using heresy and orthodoxy is something that goes back in hoplite scholarship all the way to the beginning. You know, the Athismos orthodoxy versus the Athismos heresy. I'm a believer in an actual push. Why it's called Athismos, not a non-pushing Athismos. But again, the argument with hoplite battle is that the Athismos comes in later. But we're not talking about the beginning of the hoplite, are we? We're talking about the end of the hoplite. And so there's another controversy there, of course. You've got hoplites throughout the 5th, 4th, and into the 3rd century BC. You've got the idea of hoplites still being used in the battles against the Macedonian phalanx in the late 4th century. But you've, of course, had evolution in hoplite tactics. We've got the reforms of Iphicrates, again, a controversy. Some people don't believe they're real or that they're not what they're described to be, because Diodorus describes them as the doubling of the length of the Dori spear, which gets very close to the length of the Macedonian sarissa, which is complicated, A, because so few survive, B, it's complicated because when the sarissa does appear on the battlefield in the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, no one mentions that it's very long. So it's sort of an idea that, well, maybe the spears were getting longer, and the shield shrinks, so the peltae of the Macedonian phalangite isn't noteworthy, particularly in comparison to an aspis. However, and of course the aspis is the typical hoplite shield, you'll still find it called a hoplon. Another controversy, the hoplon's the panoply, the whole lot. The aspis is the shield, so it's not a hoplon shield. The hoplite is the whole lot, and it seems from various documents that the hoplite is signified by a helmet, a shield, and a spear. That seems to be the things that they're given. There are, of course, hoplites who don't have helmets on funerary stelae. Often they all wear a cloak, either am I going to say the Greek right, a chalmus or a hemation. Anyway, apologies if I got those Greek words wrong. What you've got, of course, is that when the Macedonian phalangites come in, then the phalanx under Philip first and Alexander, wipe all before them, both Greek and Persian and Illyrian and others. It's sort of like, well, this is obviously the way we need to go. Now, peculiarly, of course, on the right flank of the phalanx, we also have the hypaspists, 3,000 men who defend the king and also the right flank of the phalanx. There's still a debate as to whether they are hoplites or phalangites. Given that their ranks are filled from the phalanx, I think it's more likely that they are a double taxis of phalangites rather than hoplites as such. But there are those who consider that they may have been a hoplite hypaspist phalanx. Oh, now, what that, of course, creates an issue with is the idea that if you've got a hoplite part of the Macedonian army, and there are indeed Macedonian hoplites, allied hoplites, who fight with the Macedonian armies under Alexander the Great and later. And then you've got this sort of like, well, we're not willing to give up our traditions of being hoplites in Greece in the fourth into the third century. However, there comes a point, and I'm going to pinpoint an actual point where I think the Greek hoplite ceases to exist, and that is the Battle of Salassia in 222 BC. Now, if you're a cricket fan, of course, you can make fun of 222, 2 for 222. Anyway, I digress. The Battle of Salassia is a battle between the Macedonians led by Antigonus III, and so Macedon and the Achaean League fighting against Sparta under the command of Cleomenes III. So this battle is one that you can pinpoint because Sparta obviously has a very long tradition of hoplite warfare. They are the premier hoplite city-state, and regardless of whether you think they're invincible warriors or not, they are still regarded as the epitome of hoplite culture, for lack of a better term. And so when we get to the Battle of Salassia, what we find is that the Macedonians and the Achaean League invade the homeland of the Spartans in Laconia with 29,000 men, which includes a phalanx. And to counter it, Cleomenes raises an army of 20,000 men, and this consists of Lacedaemonians armed in the Macedonian fashion. So it seems like at this point it's been shown time and time again that the phalanx is superior to the Macedonian phalanx, and the Hellenistic phalanx is superior to the typical hoplite phalanx, and there's reasons for that, and that this is the last stalwart bastion of the hoplite phalanx. And in 222 BC, they raise a phalanx in Sparta in the Macedonian fashion. And so it's the time where the hoplite disappears and they've been replaced by a Macedonian armed troops. Now, there are other issues with that battle, of course. They haven't had time to train as a Macedonian phalanx. It's a rush job to raise that large army, and they get slaughtered. We get Plutarch telling us that of 6,000 Spartan citizens, only 200 survive. So it's an interesting one in terms of the superiority of the Macedonian phalanx over the hoplite phalanx, which again is a problem because what we tend to get in the sources, the later sources, of course, which is the superiority of the Roman legion over the Macedonian and Hellenistic phalanx, it's peculiar that the Greeks can't see the weaknesses of the Macedonian phalanx, or can't take advantage of the weaknesses of the Macedonian phalanx in the way that the Romans can. And I think there's a reason for that, and that is that even in the 3rd century, we're still dealing with innovators and strategic and tactical thinkers when it comes to the Macedonian and Hellenistic phalanx, who are not stagnated. And I think by the time that the Romans are fighting the Macedonian phalanx in the 2nd century BC, we're dealing with a stagnated phalanx. We're dealing with a Macedonian and Hellenistic phalanx that by that time has fought mostly Macedonian and Hellenistic phalanxes of their own, and they aren't thinking strategically or tactically, and that's what leads to the defeats at Kynaskephalae and Pydna especially. And so it's interesting that the hoplite phalanx isn't able to see those weaknesses on the flanks, separate, fight in battles that are terrain that's not suitable. Having said that, of course, we've got commanders of the phalanx who may well not have been drawn into unfavorable terrain. They may not have allowed their phalanx to separate in the way that happens at Pydna and Kynaskephalae. Anyway, so I think that we can pinpoint that the Battle of Salassia in 222 BC is when the hoplite phalanx has its last gasp, almost literally. And it's an interesting one. Possibly it's about depth. Possibly it's about the number of spear points coming to the fore. The Macedonian phalanx and even the phalanx at Salassia is 10,000. So you're dealing with the traditional size. And again, one of the stagnations that happens after that is the idea that the phalanx, the Macedonian Hellenistic phalanx, gets larger and larger. And so by Pydna and kind of Skyphli, it's 16,000, which is almost doubling of the original 9 and a bit thousand of Alexander and Philip. And that's also the mathematical division of the Tactica phalanx, which is possibly another sign of stagnation. They're much more worried about maths than they are about effectiveness on the battlefield. But even at Salassia, I think we're dealing with an army that is really strategic and tactical in its thinking and its leadership. We've talked about Philopoemen before. He doesn't die until 182 BC. So he's one of the last great generals of the phalanx, but that is the Macedonian phalanx. But he also, fights on Crete, so he's using other kinds of warfare too, in combination with an anvil of the Hellenistic phalanx, and you use light troops and cavalry around it. It's solid in defense, but it's also almost unstoppable in attack when it's used properly. Anyway, I think, therefore, that's the answer I'm going to give you today. I think that's now that was me attempting to say your name, not saying the word today. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say is the Battle of Salassia in 222 BC is when the Greek hoplite ceased to exist. Thanks. Join me again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.